Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note, by Mitchell Heisman. This reading was produced using Natural Reader 14, a product of Natural Soft Limited. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Part 1. God is Technology. How the singularity of monotheism transcended biology and primed the technological genesis of God. Overthrowing ourselves. Singularity and secularization. No people has ever insisted more firmly than the Jews that history has a purpose and humanity a destiny. At a very early stage in their collective existence they believed they had detected a divine scheme for the human race, of which their own society was to be a pilot. They worked out their role in immense detail. Paul Johnson, A History of the Jews. Although I firmly believe, wrote Albert Einstein, that the chasm between Jewish theology and Spinozism can never be bridged, I am not less convinced that Spinoza's contemplation of the world, Weltanschauung, was thoroughly imbued with the principles and sentiments that characterize so many Jewish intellectuals. I feel I would never have come so near to Spinoza had I not myself been of Jewish extraction and grown up in a Jewish milieu. I find this rather ironic. Spinoza, author of one of the most radical attempts to overcome Jewish particularity in the name of human universalism, could be considered one of the inventors of modernity. Yet, somehow, modernity itself is in some way Jewish. Einstein seems to have felt, contra Spinoza himself, that Jewish-influenced principles and sentiments somehow drew him closer to Spinoza's modern universalism. Einstein cited two Jewish traits as the most basic: the bond that has united the Jews for thousands of years and that unites them today is, above all, the democratic ideal of social justice, coupled with the ideal of mutual aid and tolerance among all men. The second characteristic trait of Jewish tradition is the high regard in which it holds every form of intellectual aspiration and spiritual effort. These two character traits of concern for social justice and intellectual aspiration are combined in secular Jewish thinkers such as Karl Marx, Noam Chomsky, and even Baruch Spinoza's support for democracy. Yet all three of these men are notable for their lack of concern for any special interests of the Jewish community. The very nature of the concerns of social justice come into direct conflict with any form of privilege, including that of being a member of the chosen people. This secular Jewish phenomenon of conscientious objection or dissent against the prevailing injustice system has a long biblical heritage behind it. After all, who are the prophets except the most piercing and relentless social critics of the Jewish people? The Bible is largely their story, and the political history of ambitious kings is largely seen through the lenses of priests and prophets. Let justice well up as waters, roared the prophet Amos, and righteousness as a mighty stream, Amos 5:24. Is this same passion for justice still found among Jews? From a secular view of human behavior, many secular Jewish social activists almost appear as if they are following the prophet Micah's moral injunction, to do justice and to love goodness, and to walk modestly with your God, Micah 6:8. It was exactly this concern for justice that lay at the core of Hitler's lethal attack on Jews and Judaism. Einstein thought that the Nazis saw the Jews as a non-assimilable element that cannot be driven into uncritical acceptance of dogma, and that, therefore, as long as it exists at all, threatens their authority because of its insistence on popular enlightenment of the masses. Which of us young Jews, wondered the German Jewish mystic Gershom Scholem in 1915, has not had the same royal dream and seen himself as Jesus and Messiah of the downtrodden? This tendency towards messianism, religious or secular, is an expression of a general Jewish collective unconscious. Marx's proletarian revolution is an imagined or theoretical realization of that same royal dream on this earth that a young Jew named Jesus had 2,000 years earlier. According to the American critic and essayist Edmund Wilson, the characteristic genius of the Jew has been especially a moral genius. Nobody but a Jew, Marx, could have fought so uncompromisingly and obstinately for the victory of the dispossessed classes. Marx is probably the most influential modern example of the famous, and infamous, Jewish proclivity for the left-wing socialistic causes. His vision of a communist culmination of human history that resolves the contradictions of the capitalistic world by turning it upside down was nothing less than a 19th-century updating of the primal archetype of the first revolution, the Mosaic inversion of the Egyptian pyramid hierarchy. Marxism could thus be interpreted as a secularization of a biblically based, messianic Weltanschauung. The issue behind secularization concerns the origin of modern values. If reason, in itself, cannot decide fundamental values, then so-called secular values cannot be fundamentally rational. The traditional idea of secularization, most strongly associated with Nietzsche, claimed that the modern idea of progress and its egalitarian values were residues of belief in God, biblical values without biblical faith. Modern egalitarianism and modern progress, in his view, were secularizations of biblical values. And at the root of biblical values was the slave morality that glorified Jewish national political failure. Jewish nationalism, taken to its logical extreme, is impossible. That way of life leads to the maximization of holy political biological principles and notions of duty uninhibited by any restraints of conscience, as exemplified by the Nazis. Jews have traditionally defined themselves in a way that is inseparable from adherence to certain laws or principles, i.e. Torah, whose very content clash with exactly this kind of total maximization. The Bible claims that David was denied God's sanction to build the first great temple in Jerusalem. "You will not build a house in my name, for you are a man of battles and have shed blood." I Chronicles 28:3. If Judaism punishes its greatest political warriors for being political warriors, how can such a morality secure the struggle for its own political existence? Jewish existence before 1948 was largely one of an exiled people under foreign rule. For less than 100 years during the reign of David and Solomon in the 10th century BC, Jews lived as a unified territorial nation. A Jewish state of smaller area also existed for about a century under the Maccabees in the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. Over a history of about 3,000 years before 1948, then, Jews lived in their own state on their own territory for these two relatively short periods. Even in those periods of Jewish autonomy, successful kings faced the challenge of God-inspired prophets. Ahab had his Elijah, David his Nathan. The kings come down to us largely through the eyes of the prophets, emphasizing their sins over successes. In the 18th chapter of Theological Political Treatise, Spinoza argued that Amos, Isaiah, and Jeremiah and other prophets hastened the fall of ancient Jewish polities because of their subversive effect on the civil order. Even devout kings often found prophets intolerable because of their assumption of authority to decide what action was pious or impious, and even to berate the kings themselves if the latter had the hardihood to transact any business, public or private, against their judgment. Such freedom brought religion more harm than good, not to mention that great civil wars also originated from the prophet's retention of so important a right. If God is the King of Kings, the prophetic spokesmen of God ultimately have the last word over the kings, regardless of the political consequences. From this stems a vicious cycle of monotheistic morality. Political failure seeks solution in greater piety. Greater piety of this distinctly Jewish morality often contributes to political failure, for it reprimands the functional evil often necessary for political strength. The entire premise of a political, territorial existence, the very affirmation that one is willing to kill others to exist on a piece of land, raises consciousness towards acknowledgement that injustice is the founding father of politics. The dynamics of evil are pregnant in the very notion that one values life enough to do what it takes to secure its existence on this earth. A political existence requires acceptance that one is willing to choose between conflicting political interests, to choose among evils. Applied in their most radical forms, Jewish ethical values are politically self-destructive. The historical consequence of living these Jewish values was a depoliticized existence in the diaspora. The very survival of the Jews as people without a state was founded on a preference for justice over power. The survival of Jewish conceptions of morality, then, is inseparable from the survival of the Jews as a post-political people. Jewish ethical values provided both justification for their own stateless existence, and an identity appropriate to that mode of existence. In summary, the monotheistic moral values invented by Jews are directly related to the unique kind of unpolitical existence that has characterized most of Jewish history. The moral of Jewish morality is the simple tautology that power rules, whatever the content of its cause. Only if justice aspires to power can injustice be made powerless. The final moral of diaspora moralism was that Jews stood guilty of being unable to defend their own families. At Auschwitz, God bestowed more evidence for his non-existence. The presumed eternity of Mosaic law seemed to imply belief in the eternity of the Jewish condition. Its timelessness could only be maintained by divorcing itself from the context and conditions of Jewish history. It appears, however, that the ethics of Judaism were neither eternal nor universal. They were, at least in part, the inversion of the values of politically powerful oppressors of Jews. When the Zionists' struggle over the Galut condition yielded the baffling outcome of victory, the original conditions of Jewish existence were also defeated. As Jews trade historic places, and reach a pinnacle of political power themselves in a world where the legacy of monotheistic ethics have conquered, the logic of Jewish ethics, turned against Jews themselves, grow ripe for self-destruction. At the nadir of Jewish power as metaphorical slaves in Egypt, the pyramid hierarchy of the Egyptians was inverted. At the height of the kind of power Jews are capable of, Judaism opens the possibility of inverting its own hierarchical pyramid. The height of Jewish political power thus becomes the source of its own undoing. The peak is where the Jewish idea plummets. A well-known rabbi once explained the Jewish humanist condition with a joke: if we Jews are 5% better than the rest of the world, we can be a light unto the nations. If we are 25% better than the rest of the world, we can bring the Messiah. If we're 50% better than the rest of the world, we'll all be dead. There is only one way to most fully approach moral self-consistency without hypocrisy, and that way is suicide. This is the ultimate logic of Jewish morality. The greatest proof that Judaism has never been consistently egalitarian is the survival of the Jews. The proto-egalitarian aspects of Judaism's social ethics were adaptive for Jews during their normative historical condition as an oppressed people. However, when Jews achieve power themselves, to be self-consistent in the sense of wishing the relatively powerless, i.e. Palestinians or Nazis, to gain power and triumph over Jewish power amounts to a death wish. From this experience comes Jewish self-consciousness of the relativity of Jewish ethics. To fully persist with these ethics in conditions of political power is the definition of political suicide. More generally, a principled leftist who rails against concentration of power would be hypocritical to not attack the concentration of his or her own power. Leftist self-realization implies progress towards self-negation. Leftist egalitarian arguments only make sense when embedded in the safety of provincial horizons. Realization of the most extreme attempt to fulfill the logic of equality would result in biological self-destruction. The radical inconsistencies of Nazism exposed something about us Jews. The Nazis exposed our central socio-biological contradiction through history. Jews are biological beings characterized by anti-biological values. Values that are ultimately anti-biological ultimately imply biological self-negation. This historical contradiction was resolved through Nazi death camps. Hitler refuted Marx at Auschwitz. Nazi extermination camps resolved this contradiction by compelling Jews to participate in the most extreme biological consequences of their own anti-biological values. The Lord preserveth the strangers, he relieveth the fatherless and the widow, but the way of the wicked he turneth upside down. Psalm 146, 9. The insiders of mainstream Judaism are characterized by an emphasis on the outsiders of mainstream Judaism. While the average Jew is neither a stranger among Jews, nor a widow, nor an orphan, the average Jew is commanded to not alienate, mistreat, or exile the outsider or vulnerable fringe Jew. The ultimate reason for this, I think, is that Jews as a whole are the strangers and outsiders among Gentiles in the larger world. This teaching goes to the core of the Jewish contribution to human values: you shall not ill-treat any widow or orphan, Exodus 22:21. Yet from the view of natural selection, these margins of existence are among the most vulnerable to extinction. By championing the cause those most vulnerable to extinction, overgeneralized as the cause of all humankind, Jews have championed their own cause against the logic of natural or artificial selection. By killing the Jews, the Nazis killed Jewish resistance to the supremacy of biological evolution. After the collective trauma of the Nazi genocide, Jews lost their way. Some of the extreme Zionists virtually confirmed Nazi assertions about the primacy of land and race. Some Jews lost sight of what they were and became what Nazis said they were, a biologically conceived race. The ultimate question here is, does God or Hitler represent the highest understanding of Judaism and monotheism? A purely biological understanding of Judaism would represent the ultimate victory of Nazism and Auschwitz. It might be true, but is it true? Was God only a biological survival mechanism of the Jews, or does God have an empirical basis beyond biology and race? It is truly remarkably just how profoundly the biblical creation story contradicts every aspect of the Darwinian way of thinking. The very idea that God created separate and distinct species implies that both humans and other animal species will not fundamentally change beyond the basic form in which God created them. Creation implies a kind of biological status quo. Humans and animal species will not gradually stray from the form in which God created them, they will not evolve. If reason, in itself, is unable to determine fundamental values, then modern values cannot be purely rational. I think Nietzsche was right in drawing a connection between biblical values and modern egalitarianism. Modern humanism was most especially influenced by the biblical emphasis on the distinctiveness of the human race from all other animals. The infinite value of each human life in God's image formed the value foundations for modern human rights. From the standpoint of natural selection, foundational human rights are literally supernatural in the sense that the universal right to life works in functional opposition to natural selection. A literal enforcement of equal rights tends to preserve the biological status quo against eugenic attempts to deliberately change the genetic composition of a population and steer the biological evolution of the human race. The progress of modern egalitarianism and modern right, if realized, would accomplish the outlawing of conscious eugenic control over biological evolution and effectually glorify the present biological status quo, almost as if realizing the unchanging Eden of God's creation. The Judeo-Christian modern tradition generally views death as an enemy. The preservation of all human life, along with ethical prohibitions against discriminating against individuals on the basis of their biological characteristics, works in direct opposition to the selective processes of biological evolution. Biological evolution itself seems to be the enemy of modern, leftward progress. This is what the Nazis waged war against, leftwards egalitarian progress that works in direct opposition to biological progress through selective death. Jewish biblical modern values devalue death, and thus devalue natural selection, and thus devalue biological evolution. What Nazis failed to grasp, however, is that God does not represent the opposite of evolution, but rather, a paradigm shift within evolution. Biblical modern values devalue biological evolution because they reach beyond biology towards post-biological evolution. The obvious incompatibility between the conception of creation and Darwinian evolution can very easily obscure the evolutionary reason why these two paradigms necessarily clash. If God's rule over creation represents the rule of post-biological evolution over biological evolution, and God represents the evolutionary successor to biology at the point at which biology becomes obsolete, then creation appears distinctly anti-evolutionary for a specific evolutionary reason. The point at which God rules is precisely the point at which biological evolution has been slowed to a stop. Creation would then be analogous to the creation of a virtual world, i.e. a computer simulation, that preserves the memory of biology in post-biological form. The Bible, by being the embodiment of a post-biological form of evolution, i.e. memes, embodies a first step towards total creation of civilization. Those who live in the artificial or virtual world created by following the commandments or ways of God have taken a step towards realizing the post-biological paradigm in a biologically based world. If the Bible represents a kind of post-biological foresight by people who were quite aware that the end destination had not yet been reached, then the idea of evolution or progress towards the messianic end is inherent in the biblical construction. If God represents an ancient insight into the ultimate trajectory of post-biological evolution, and artificial intelligence represents the material clarification of that primal insight, then the relationship between the biblical God and secularization into the modern idea of progress becomes clarified. A God AI would represent the very culmination of modern human progress. Progress. Progress towards what? For the idea of progress to uphold its original claims of making some kind of coherent, rational sense, one must have some sense of what one is progressing towards. What would it look like if progress reached its presumed destination or end? The modern idea of progress, as formulated and clarified in the law of accelerating returns, evolved out of a God-based Weltanschauung. God AI is evolving out of the workings of the modern idea of progress. The fulfillment of this interplay between the Bible and modernity would be the overcoming of Nietzsche in the creation of God. From an evolutionary perspective, it becomes clear that Judaism, as the source of the original monotheist insight, had to combine contradictory values. As a first decisive alignment with an ultimate trajectory of post-biological evolution, Judaism took a step towards a pattern of progress culminating in a transcendence of biology, God. Since Jews themselves could not fully escape being biological beings, however, Jews could only survive to continue down that progressive path towards God by also satisfying the contradictory values that perpetuated their biological nature. Judaism, generally speaking, compromises the extremes of both biology and the premature transcendence of biology. The inherently precarious nature of Jewish existence arises from attempt to find a compromised middle ground between these two extremes. This middling contradiction, secularized in the form of liberal democracy, is exemplified by Israel's contradictory behavior towards the Palestinians. Only the singularity could potentially resolve the Israel-Palestine conflict by transcending the human basis of the conflict. Only an actual, extant God that transcends the differences between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam could bring out the kernels of truth common to these and other religions. On a purely human level, monotheistic modern ethics seem to find realization in political biological self-destruction. Yet it is no accident that the logic of modern egalitarianism compels opening your mind to death. The final logic of revolution is overthrowing ourselves as biological beings. What appears as death on a biological level is the key to life on a post-biological level. Auschwitz and the singularity are two diametrically opposite final solutions to the paradox at the core of Judaism. Auschwitz represents technology mastered by biology. The singularity would represent biology mastered by technology. Auschwitz resolved the central socio-biological contradiction of Jewish modernity on the side of biology. The singularity would resolve the central socio-biological contradiction of Jewish modernity on the side of technology. The Jewish idea, originally inverting the hierarchies of others, completes its progress by inverting itself. The paradox by which Jewish political power becomes its moral undoing finds its historical solution in the singularity. On a purely human level, Jewish ethics appear to lead to political insanity because they originally presupposed that God overcomes human politics. The singularity would be the greatest inversion of the human pyramid hierarchy of all. The singularity would be the Exodus paradigm transposed onto a world historical scale. The singularity would be the technological genesis of God.